And joining us now to debate minority parliaments and their effect on democracy. In Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Janice MacKinnon, professor at the University of Saskatchewan. In the nation's capital, Susan Delacourt, senior writer at the Toronto Star, and Jeffrey Simpson, national affairs columnist at the Globe and Mail. And here in studio, Rick Salutin, also columnist with the Globe and Mail, and we welcome back Ned Franks, professor emeritus of political studies from Queen's University. Now, as I welcome everybody else to the program, both in Points Beyond and here in the studio, it's not often, in fact, I don't think we've ever done it, where we've had two columnists from the same newspaper on the same program. But Rick and Jeffrey had columns on subsequent days about this issue that were an interesting contrast, and so we thought this might be a good chance to break our rule. And let's look at Rick's first. We're going to do a little excerpt from your column back on September 11th, Rick. In a vital democracy, you wrote, like ancient Athens or the Iroquois Confederacy, people were involved in politics continually. Under our system, politics more or less equals elections. So you could call frequent elections our form of participatory democracy. It keeps citizens engaged and parties on their toes. Under a stable majority, everyone goes to sleep for 4 years. Do you think we'd have even the minimal action we've seen from Mr. Harper on the economy or on withdrawal from Afghanistan if he'd had a majority? I don't think minority governments are inherently unstable. I'd call them inherently alert. The current one has indeed been unstable since it's so distant from the majority of members in the House and voters in the country. But, say, a Liberal minority could well find enough common ground with the Bloc and the NDP to enact many things that most citizens would value. Follow up on that if you would, Rick. Inherently alert. What does that mean for you?
It means that the citizens can stay engaged with the, well, put it this way, if there's going to be an election around the corner, then citizens tend to stay more engaged with the parliamentary process. In that case, the people in Parliament and the party leaders have to pay more attention to the citizens. So you have, as well as to each other, so you have a kind of more lively political situation. There's nothing more deadening, I think, democratically than a government that can govern for 4 or 5 years, and everybody knows that it's a virtual dictatorship in that period.
I think your friend at the Globe called them friendly dictatorships, and I'm going to quote him right now, because the following day, here's what Jeff Simpson wrote. Minorities are more fun for those who enjoy political theater. Voters who don't like the largest party of the day think minorities are great because they sometimes stop the biggest party from getting its way. Still others think minorities are more, quote, representative and democratic. In theory, minority governments should force parties to work together to keep Parliament functioning for at least a few years. In practice, since everyone is looking at every statement and decision through a short-term political lens, posturing and partisanship overwhelm the theoretical possibilities of cooperation. Parties can't easily cooperate today when they think that they might be campaigning against each other tomorrow. The big parties certainly won't cooperate, since they seem to believe that the next election will give them the knockout blow for a majority. All politics, all or almost all the time, it's a hell of a way to run a country. Jeffrey, this is obviously a somewhat bleaker picture of minority government than Rick is painting here, but you know, you also wrote the friendly dictatorship, as we just pointed out. So don't minority parliaments, excuse me, Ned Franks, make the friendly dictatorship less likely to happen?
When I first came to Ottawa a long time ago, I was a parliamentary intern, and I worked inside Parliament for 3 parties during the Trudeau minority of 72. Then I wrote a book about Joe Clark's short-lived government. Now I'm watching this. So I've been inside and been a close observer, and I stick by what I wrote. If you look at it from the inside, as I did, the tactical daily considerations of survival outweigh most of the time any long-term thinking. And it becomes all politics all the time. If the citizenry were so alert and so desirous of this situation, why is it, therefore, that this fall public opinion surveys showed that something over 80% of the people didn't want an election? I mean, if this produced an alertness in the public and engaged them in the public, i.e. this string of minority governments win elections, you wouldn't have expected that to happen.
Janice, I want to get you in, but first I think I probably owe Rick a chance to respond to that.
I think that it became fashionable this fall to say, I don't want an election. The cheerleading was led by people in the media, and it was,
the PM also said it was a useless election.
Yeah, and whoever had an advantage in it. But I don't think that politics is something that's a matter of what do you feel like, what do you want? I don't see it as a sort of consumerist or shopping alternative. The point is you're a citizen and you engage in politics because you're a citizen. So whatever comes up, you deal with it. I think to put it in terms of what do you want is reducing it to the level of going shopping.
Okay, let's get Citizen MacKinnon in on this, because you were a cabinet minister in a minority parliament in Saskatchewan. Where are you on this Simpson-Salutin continuum, if I can put it that way?
I think minority parliaments can work for a brief period of time. If you look back at the Pearson years, they actually were very exceptional years. Unprecedented prosperity in the 1960s. The federal government could create all those social programs because it had the jurisdiction and the money, none of which would be true today. So there was a natural agenda that the Liberals had that the NDP could support. Now, if you fast forward to 2006 until now, I actually think that Canadians, if they look back over this period, they're going to say they have benefited from the minority Conservative government in this really important sense. If you consider the policies that the Conservative Party had prior to 2006 and their policies today, you will see that Prime Minister Harper was able to use the fact that his government was in a minority position to move his party to the center, to change their approach to social issues, and also to get a broader, more expansive view of Canada. This is no longer, as it was in the past, a regional party. It is a national party, and I think all Canadians are better off having two national parties to choose from rather than just one. So I think there have been benefits, but I also agree with Jeff. They're limited. They are inherently short-term in their vision, they're inherently unstable, and they are big spenders.
Susan Delacourt, where do you come down on the inherently unstable or inherently alert continuum?
Well, I would like to say I agree with Rick, because we're supposed to be in favor of democracy. I think where we would all agree is it would be nice if elections and politics were played in any way that sort of encouraged the citizens and encouraged the political parties to have an intelligent debate. The problem that we're seeing is that neither politics nor elections these days are fought in any way that is ways that more resemble the schoolyard than do serious policy debate. So if you like democracy, you can't like a lot of the aspects of this minority government, and it is because it's hyper-partisan. You know, a lot is, as Professor Franks was saying, a lot of it has to do with the tone. And that can't be, I think, understated. The tone here has been very bad.
Ned Franks, it's partly tone and it's also partly money. The one thing I hear frequently from people on the street, on the subway, whatever, is, can you believe we're going to go out and spend $300 million on another election when we just had one, a year ago? Does that offend you, that notion?
Democracy is a terrible system of government. As Churchill said, it just happens to be better than any other one that's ever been tried. And you pay for it. I mean, I don't worry about the expense of the election. What I worry about is the futility, because what I call it has happened in our political discourse is a dumbing down. And I was really grateful to Jeffrey Simpson when he wrote a week or so ago that all of this nonsense about not raising taxes is really distorting the whole discussion of what we have to do when we start to get out of this recession and have to pay off our debts, because it might turn out that raising taxes is the fairest way to the people of Canada and the best for the economy. And yet we wind up with party leaders, as a matter of principle, saying they won't raise taxes.
Let's go to Jeffrey, and then Rick wants to follow as well.
Well, I think in a democracy, since that's the word that we're bandying about, you need a period of time before you can properly judge whether the measures that a government has introduced and Parliament has passed are working and are effective and are desirable. Let me give you some examples, and Ned just raised taxes. If you're in a constant election campaign, you're always fearful that if you raise taxes, you're going to get bombarded by critics, and so it scares you off doing certain things. If in 1968, Mr. Trudeau, who had a majority, worried about what the immediate reaction was, and it was quite negative, to the Official Languages Act, he probably wouldn't have done it. You've got to let time pass. That's why we've had the tradition of 4 or 5 years between elections with majorities. That's why the Americans have fixed-term 4-year elections. That's one of the reasons. There are others why a Mexican president serves for 6 years, a French president for 5. When you're in this vortex of minority governments with all politics all the time, you don't allow a sufficient amount of time to pass to make a mature judgment as to whether the measures the government has introduced are desirable and have worked over a period of time.
Rick Salutin.
Well, you know, I think that amounts to saying that the democratic part of our parliamentary system is the least important part, and what we want is some efficiency and effectiveness. And I think that is the nature of representative systems like the one we have, and they're counter-democratic. I mean, I don't quite see how people can avoid the fact that minority parliaments are inherently democratic. Whether they're inherently stable or unstable is a completely separate question, but they are democratic, as opposed to governments that routinely get less than 50% of the vote and way more than 50% of the seats. That's laggard. That's almost unique to our system of government. The UK has it as well. And that's the biggest, you know, people don't want to just, you know, it seems to me the political impulse in human beings wants to be more engaged and more reflected.
But I got to follow up with you on that, because you say it's inherently democratic, or it's certainly democratic at the very least. There will be people who will say, how democratic is it when a party like the Bloc Québécois in one province nationally gets, you know, has all their seats in one province, gets 8% of the vote nationwide, and they've got almost 50 seats in the parliament.
That's a peculiarity of Quebec, but it's way, the overall situation is way less undemocratic in a minority parliament than it is in the typical parliament. I mean, what would happen if Harper had you know, a majority with the way Chrétien did, with 40-something% of the votes?
I think Chrétien got one with 38% once.
Yeah, so, you know, so what, I don't understand, you know, why that isn't the biggest crisis before us politically.
Janice MacKinnon, what do you think on that?
Well, I think what I said before, I think in some circumstances minority parliaments work, but in many cases they don't. And one of the problems, and I think this is where there's a disconnect between what happens in Parliament and the average Canadian. I think the average Canadian wants the parties to cooperate. They want Parliament to work. Parliament doesn't work, and it doesn't work because of what was mentioned before, the hyper-partisanship. And I don't think it's just one party that's guilty of this. I think it's part of our system. I was in a party, I was in a caucus. The caucus is always united around the view that we are the good guys, they're the bad guys, we have the good ideas, they have the bad ideas. If the caucus doesn't hang together, the government can fall. So it's basically at its core confrontational. We saw an example last fall in which Prime Minister Harper was very partisan. To many Canadians right now, Michael Ignatieff is being very partisan. He's saying, look, I'm withdrawing my support from the government mainly because I'm a liberal and the government is conservative. That is, there isn't some huge issue that, as he said, has made him say, well, you know, reluctantly, I've tried to get the government to change or modify, but there's this massive issue that is dividing us. And I think this is very frustrating to Canadians. They don't want the level of partisanship. But it's basic to our system, and there's this disconnect between parliamentarians and what Canadians would like to see.
Okay, quick follow from Rick, and then I'm going to quote Susan.
That's such a narrow insider's view in terms of parties. I mean, I think what we've actually got in the country is a social democratic majority. If you put together the NDP, the Liberals, and the Bloc, and what's dysfunctional about this Parliament is because Harper got more seats than anybody else. He gets to form the government. We don't have a system where these other parties could get together.
Well, we do. It happened.
Well,
it's called the coalition.
I know, and then the country freaked out, or at least the media people and the political elites freaked out. They couldn't cope with it, and yet it would have represented the sentiment of the country. It's not about hyper-partisanship. It's about the inability of the sentiment of the majority in the country to break through this ossified system.
Okay, stand by, everybody. I want to read something Susan Delacourt had on her Toronto Star blog recently. A modest proposal, an open letter to her bosses at Torstar. Get comfortable, this is a little long. What if the 4 major print outlets decided to pool resources and collaboratively cover the election campaign? It could be a model of collaboration over competition, just what our readers say they want from the media. Taking our cue from the current Parliament, we would then turn on each other. I could write about how the Globe and Mail is so broke and desperate that it had to work with the likes of the socialists at the Sun or the separatists at Can West. We could run editorials mocking our competitors for being weak or just visiting the leaders' buses. We could regularly accuse the Globe, the Sun, or Can West of a hidden agenda to destroy the Canadian media. And with the money we save, we could run around handing out free Toronto Stars to people, featuring large ads that claim sole credit for the election coverage. Your subscriber dollars at work is a nice logo for a billboard, don't you think? A couple of weeks into the arrangement, we could start daring each other to break the deal and try to go it alone. We can run stories daily, wondering which media outlet will blink first. If we decide to abandon the deal, however, we will portray that as an act of strength, a virtue of our superior organizational muscle. As we know from observing this Parliament, there's nothing the public likes more than feats of strength and ongoing withering mockery dressed up as desire for cooperation. Susan, you're a hell of a writer, I gotta say. That's really well done. But really, ongoing withering mockery, is that really what Parliament's come to in your view?
Yeah, I think it has. I did that as that metaphor. Some people actually took it seriously, if you can believe that. I did that to show that this is a unique situation we have here. You would not be able to behave this way in your normal life, to ask somebody to help you, to cooperate, to help government pass bills, and then turn around and take out ads about them or laugh at them in the media. Like it really is, and all parties are guilty of this. It's just a ridiculous situation. And I think if we want to talk about, to the earlier point, I wanted to say that I think we should examine too what this all politics all the time, as Jeffrey has said, has done to the role of the individual member. Because of the hyper-partisan and election readiness state of everyone here, individual MPs are not allowed to dissent with their party. If you're a cabinet minister, you're not even allowed to speak in Mr. Harper's government. It has become a strange situation where discipline is everything. And as we know, a lot of good decisions don't get made when the party is just functioning for the team. Individually and in caucuses now, you don't see much discussion about the issues. They're all just sitting there with waving their party colors and waiting until they get on the campaign planes again.
Ned Franks, if Susan's accurately characterized this, and I see no reason to disagree with her, is that different from the state of affairs back in the 1960s when Mr. Pearson was apparently handling minority parliaments quite skillfully?
There was a difference that the Liberal Party had taken the opportunity of Diefenbaker's majority to rethink what they wanted to do with government. There was a conference in Kingston which led to the thinking that led to the important reforms in social and other legislation afterwards. I haven't seen the Liberal Party renew itself that way, nor have I seen the NDP do it. What I have seen is a sort of day-to-day knee-jerk response of outrage from them without really having a pretty coherent sense of what they'd like to do when they were in.
Jeffrey, how much of the ill feeling towards continued minority parliament that you do pick up across the country is due, in your view, to contentment? People are content.
Well, I hadn't actually ever thought of that. I mean, are people content? What's really happened in our politics, let me answer it this way. We in the media in Ottawa, or at least some members of the media in Ottawa, spend a huge amount of time, Rick seems to think we run the country, dealing with who's up and who's down and what the political significance of this or that is and extracting every conceivable political significance. And yet, over the last, 3, 4, 5 years, Canadian politics has been remarkably stable. The share of the popular vote in elections hasn't varied very much. The polls don't show big variances. The Bloc Québécois is sitting there as the largest party in Quebec. The NDP has its 15, 16, 17%. The Liberals are in it. I mean, so stability is what has really been interesting. Does that mean contentment, or does that mean that the country is actually fractured into a bunch of blocks and those blocks don't move very effectively? The point I'd like to make about majority is this. In my experience watching Clark get beat on his budget, remember short-term pain for long-term gain? Remember the 18-cent excise tax on gas? That was a hard decision. That was a tough set of measures they introduced. They got defeated. Majority governments are governments that tend to make difficult decisions long-term. Minority governments are very good at spending money and lowering taxes. They're very bad at raising taxes or lowering spending. And what we're going to need in the next 3 to 4 years, because of the money that we've spent in this battle against the recession, unless we want to kick the debt off to our kids, is to bring the budget back into balance and then run surpluses, because the future means more obligations on the government because of an aging population. Therefore, we're going to need governments that either raise taxes or cut spending. And I guarantee you, as sure as we're all having this discussion, if we have more minority governments, that'll be much, much tougher to achieve.
Your friend at the Globe wants to take you on.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't disagree more. I mean, it seems to me what you've got, what Jeffrey's talking about, is a system where you have your election, you get a majority of majority government with a minority of votes, and then they go ahead and do what they want, which basically means they get behind closed doors with people with money and influence, and they do what those people want.
I don't think he's championing
That's
that
nonsense.
notion of it.
But it seems to me that's what it comes down to. This is back to the deficit gospel, cutting the deficit, worrying about the cutting programs, how are we going to deal, a sort of an accountant's mentality, which is exactly what we had during the Chrétien Martin years.
Thank God.
Well, okay, but then, you know, I think that exactly, you know, shows to me this is sort of an elitist view that the people are the preferences of the Democratic majority are just not capable of dealing with the onerous responsibilities of governing Canada. So we should get them to go away and let the people who have the money and the time deal with it.
Let me remind my dear friend, Mr. Salutin, that during those Chrétien years, the combination of Reform Party votes, I know he didn't like them, and the Liberal votes far, far eclipsed those of the other parties, and they both supported an agenda of reducing the deficit, and the country has been vastly better off by any international and domestic standard as a result of those difficult decisions.
Janice MacKinnon, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah. I'm interested in Rick's very romantic idea that these other three parties would get together and have a wonderful, harmonious government and agree on policies. I certainly don't see it that way. I mean, look where they were in Afghanistan. And the current Liberal leader has said he's going to balance the budget, and he's going to do it without raising taxes. He's going to end up cutting programs. He's going to end up cutting lots of programs. So I just don't think that his idea that there's these three parties that really would run a certain kind of Canada, and then there's the Harper government that's running a different kind of Canada, is true at all. The two major parties are both committed to balancing the budget because it makes sense in the long term, and they say they're going to do without cutting taxes. I agree that that's really interesting to see how that would play out, but this is going to mean program cuts. And I also agree with something that Professor Frank said. If there is an agenda that the NDP and the Liberals could cooperate on, it's not tomorrow's agenda, it's yesterday's agenda. It's the idea that we're going to go back and have all these social programs and the federal government's going to create them without looking at the fact that we don't have the money now. We actually have a $50 billion deficit. So I do believe you have to look realistically at the situation, not these rose-colored glasses about what it might be like if we could have it the way we wanted it.
Well, Susan, let me get Susan Delacourt to respond to this, because this past week has really been a fascinating one. Of course, when the Liberals decided after their caucus in Sudbury that they weren't going to prop up the government anymore, and they were, in fact, going to be the opposition party, the government in waiting, that meant the New Democrats and or the Blocistes had to make a decision about supporting the government, or we were going to an election. They decided to do it. Now, in a minority parliament, that's kind of the way things are supposed to work, right? If it survives, someone's got to support them. Jack Layton did that. He says he got some pretty good progress on EI as a result of it, and yet I think most of the media, what's the expression? Carved him a new one. How did that work exactly?
Well, I think that's the point I was trying to get at in that blog post. I think if you want to say that we want a parliament that works together, you're going to have to let people like Jack Layton and the NDP cooperate with the Conservative government. You're going to have to not mock them when they they'd try to do something. Again, it's the schoolyard bully thing, and everybody has engaged in it. And a lot of the things of the mockery or the carving the new one for Mr. Layton comes from the fact that he was hoisted on his own petard. He held a little birthday cake for the Liberals, I think, when to mark their 79th vote along with the Conservatives. Now, if you're interested in making Parliament work, wouldn't you be applauding the Liberals for going along with the government? I think Mr. Dion, remember that fellow? He must be saying it was that easy. All you had to do, all the Liberals have had to do for the last 3 years, if you look at the success of this, the short-term success, the Liberals were vilified for 3 years for being weak and going along with the Conservatives. And actually, they were keeping people out of an election. I do think that we want it both ways.
Let's hear Ned Franks and then Rick on this.
I have a slightly different take, that I look at this period as a transition period, and I don't know what's going to happen, because with no party being able to get a majority, we have to go one of two ways. Either we go to a place where a party does get a majority, and it might well be that a different party than the Liberals becomes the natural governing party of Canada, or we have to learn to live with minority parliaments and make more effort at compromise and reaching consensus. And I often worry about that. I think of the line of W.B. Yeats, what was it? And what rough beast as hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? And slouching towards Ottawa now, and I don't know what that beast looks like.
How many guests on this program have ever quoted Yeats before? I don't think too many. Well done, Ned Franks. Okay, Rick Salutin, go ahead.
Well, I don't think it has to be as ominous as all that, Ned. You know, the rough beast slouching toward Bethlehem. You know, you've got 4 parties in there, and 3 of them can actually get along fairly well, but...
Well, hang on, says you. Janice MacKinnon says they don't get along at all.
Yeah. They actually did get along well enough to create an agreement, sort of this coalition that was shot down. And as I say, the country freaked out, but if people could just, sort of relax a bit with that, then you have people who can get along. The problem with the system is that Harper has not got enough in common with the other parties or with the voters' sentiments that sent those other parties in to do much. Although even in this case, I think what we've seen is that the influence of the consensus in the country has moderated him in areas like providing, I don't think with a clear majority, we wouldn't have got a stimulus program out of Harper. We'd probably still be stuck in Afghanistan forever. Now, if you could actually just relax and see things a bit differently and move these pieces around in a different way, it would be perfectly functional.
Let me pick up on that notion of relaxation versus drama and put it to Jeffrey Simpson, because there have been in the last few years, some pretty high-profile dramatic moments as a result of our being in a minority parliament situation. Belinda Stronach crossed the floor to help keep Paul Martin's government alive. You saw Jack Layton do a 180 this past week in order to keep the Harper government alive. There's been no shortage of drama, the coalition, of course, being the best example. Can you say that the people of Canada are ill-served by all of the drama that is concomitant with minority parliaments?
Well, drama comes all the time in politics. I mean, people leave majority governments too, but I agree that there's more political theatrics that are consequential in minority governments, because sometimes the crossing of a floor can mean the difference between a government rising and falling. And as I said, there's just a lot more calculations that go on every single hour of every single day in minority parliaments by all political actors. If we have another minority, or one after that, let's say we're in a cycle where for a number of years we have minority government, which, by the way, I think is highly likely, because the largest number of Francophone Quebecers have disengaged from federal politics in the sense that they don't want to participate in the governance of Canada. They want to be in the government of Canada, the parliament, so that they can extract benefits from Quebec without the responsibility of being in the governance of Canada. As long as that situation prevails, it's going to be very hard to get majority governments. And under those circumstances, one of 2 things I think will happen, has to happen, i.e., some of this hyper-partisanship has to be diluted, and arrangements, habits of mind, ways of proceeding have to be found to to keep parliaments going for longer than 6 months or a year, or we have to go the Rick Salutin route, which is proportional representation, where everybody knows before we vote that we're going to have a minority/coalition government, and the only question is which constellation of parties, either before or after election, are going to run the country. Proportional representation, as somebody who's covered elections in many countries with PR systems, has a lot of virtues. But what it often leads to is exactly what Rick was deploring, which is backroom negotiations after an election as the party elites get together and figure out what the composition of the government's going to be. For example, we're having an election Monday in Germany. No one knows what the composition of the next German government will be. Will it be center-right with the right wing, center-right with the Social Democrats? We don't know the answer to that. That'll be decided behind closed doors after the election's over. Not very democratic, but it's part of the PR system.
Go ahead, Rick.
Well, let me take this case of the Bloc Québécois. Now, if you want to talk about diffusing a high drama, the separatist drama is nowhere to be found anymore. And it's been diffused by what I thought Jeff was a bit derisive toward voters in Quebec, but I think they've actually found a very good solution to remaining in Canada and working within Canada and getting off that high wire of separatism. And the party, the Bloc, has enough in common with at least the Liberals and the NDP to be able to work with them on social programs, and leaving aside the issue, that sort of hysterical issue of separation, has gone away. I think voters have actually come up with that in a way, or the system has come up with it. It's different from anything that anybody thought was going to happen, but it sort of works. And that's what I mean by relaxing. I think you could start finding new ways of dealing with these perpetual minority parliaments that would be quite creative.
Janice, can I get you to comment, though, on Jeff Simpson's earlier point, which was, at the moment, there looks like there's no conceivable route to a majority government by anybody, you know, almost as far as the eye can see. Do you agree with that?
I do and I don't. I do if you look at the current situation. You've got the Bloc in Quebec. You've got the Liberal stronghold, I guess, in downtown Toronto, Montreal, and Atlantics. And certainly in Western Canada, the Conservatives have 75 of the 92 seats. With an election tomorrow, they probably get more. So you've got regional blocks here that are going to be really hard to break down. Where I wonder, though, is that I think one thing that has not been introduced into the discussion is I think Canadians are different now than they were a year and a half ago. They've come through a very tough recession. Many of them have been hit directly by it, or else they've been frightened by it. So I think that they are going to be a much more hard-headed electorate when they go to the polls next time. I think they're going to be much closer to Jeffrey than to Rick. They're going to understand that we have some difficult decisions to make, and perhaps this idea of continuing with minorities, which was okay when the good times were rolling, may not be as appealing. And one thing, as a former politician, I have learned to respect about voters. Usually if they want something, they end up getting what they desire.
Ned Franks, give us the historical view here, because I suspect in the mid-'60s, people were saying, we can't see our way to a majority government under any circumstances. And then came Trudeau, and then came a majority.
They were miserable times in the sense of feeling good about what was happening in politics, and a lot happened, as we noticed. You know, there are ways of broadening this. For example, in Sweden, which has pure PR, many parties, what they have is a premium on consensus rather than adversarial politics. And almost every major bill that gets introduced into the Swedish Riksdag has a royal commission in effect before it, and on that royal commission are members of the major parties, and they come up with a bill that they all agree on, and then when it goes to the legislature reviews it, might change it, but they know that there is an agreement between the parties. What we do is still in the old sense of Her Majesty's government and Her Majesty's opposition, that the government produces its bills in secret, tosses them into Parliament, and then invites the dogs of the opposition to attack the bones that they've been fed. And it might not be the right way to do it if we're going to wind up with continual minority parliaments.
Let me put that to Susan Delacourt. You know, the Conservatives would say, why is everybody saying a majority government is out of anybody's grasp? We're 12 seats away. That's not that far away. Do you think there's any possibility of a majority government in the future?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I would think there definitely is. But I think to answer that, you almost have to go back to your earlier point about contentment. Contentment could also be read as apathy. I think there may be a sense, too, that the political parties and politics, the way it's played right now, and this goes to Rick's point, that there's not much that the federal government actually does to interest people. And that suits the Bloc just fine. It suits the Conservatives just fine. As you know, they signal in all kinds of ways they'd be happy with a federal government that doesn't do much. We saw Jean Chrétien made an art of low-key managerial government. So there's not much to get people excited about for a majority. There's nobody saying anything exciting to get them galvanized toward a majority either. So I think as long as we're having, you know, sort of minimalist federal government, we're going to have kind of minimalist interest and minimal participation.
Well,
too.
let me try this with the guy sitting beside you. The Conservatives have, of course, been shying away from explicitly saying we want a majority government up until very recently, where Stephen Harper let it slip that he's actually more explicitly thinking about it this time. Do you think there's political hay to be made from Canadians' weariness, if it's there, with minority parliaments, and therefore it's an argument to be advanced by Mr. Harper in saying, give me 12 more seats and I'll bring you peace and quiet for the next 4 years?
Yeah, I'm laughing because of course the Conservatives have been trying for a majority. Do you think they've been actively seeking a minority the last few elections? Of course they've been seeking a majority. They just haven't got it. Can they win one? I'm sorry, you slightly exaggerated my point. Yes, they can. And I believe one of the reasons why we saw the pirouette from the NDP this week is because they sensed their own weakness and some emerging Conservative strength, partly because of the antipathy of people's reaction to Michael Ignatieff's putting us on the election cliff. So I don't rule out the possibility that, circumstances being as they are, the Conservatives might win a majority, and they might win for the following not very glamorous reason, which is that conventional wisdom, as usual, is probably wrong. Namely, that in tough economic times, people look for big changes. In fact, in tough economic times, they usually look for the most competent managers they see, and they park the vision stuff, and they park ideology. So what Harper is a manager. Every week he makes announcements. He showers the country with announcements, and he tries to manage files one after the other, not raise expectations. It's Mr. Ignatieff who's talking about vision thing. Now, I just think in a time of tough economics, vision stuff doesn't play as well as good management. So I wouldn't be surprised if there had been an election that the Conservatives would their majority. And to repeat, I think that's why one of the reasons, apart from their own precarious financial circumstances, that the NDP decided to all of a sudden keep the government in power and avoid an election.
Rick, a minute to go here. Do you think there's political hay to be made by the Conservatives to say, we're close, give us the majority?
There may well be, and I think the result of that would be putting us back in the undemocratic morass that we've been in, that the country has been in most of this time. Nobody thinks they're going to get a majority of votes. If they get a majority of seats, then it's a setback for the democratic impulse. It gets declared to be a majority because it's the linguistic wordplay. But it leaves people out, and I find it an embarrassment. I think the situation we're in is enough. People are scared. People are scared about all kinds of things. They're scared of change. You can see it in the U.S. right now. But this situation of minority parliaments has been an opportunity to push our system in a more participatory and democratic direction.
I don't know whether Jeffrey Simpson and Rick Salutin were on that recent Globe and Mail cruise around the world. But if you were, I'd love to have been at your table. You guys would have had some good knockdown dragouts during the course of that. Can I thank our guests for being on our program this evening? Janice MacKinnon, the historian at the University of Saskatchewan, Susan Delacourt from the Toronto Star, and Rick Salutin, and Jeffrey Simpson at, that's a mistake I shouldn't have made, at the Globe and Mail in our Ottawa bureau, Ned Franks and Rick Salutin here at our studio in Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your time. Now, for more information about tonight's guests and an interactive timeline on Canada's minority parliaments, please visit us online at tvo.org/theagenda. Tonight's program produced by Alan Echenberg, and you can read Alan's post on minority parliaments and democracy. You'll find it on our Inside Agenda producers blog, also online at tvo.org/theagenda.